Welcome everyone, my name is Robius and today I bring you another episode of Assassin's Creed, The Real History, the series where we compare the representations of characters and other elements depicted within one of the Assassin's Creed games to their actual history. Please be warned of major story spoilers ahead. For today's episode, we'll be exploring the history of a major general in the British Army and Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Sir William Johnson, 1st Baronet. To start, we will explore his early life during the pregame history. Then, we will cover his life in Assassin's Creed 3 and Rogue during the in-game history, and lastly we will summarize the differences between his actual life and his portrayal in the game. Starting with the pre-game history, William Johnson was born in 1715 in the county of Meath, Ireland, to Christopher Johnson and Anne Warren. Despite his family coming from Jacobite roots, William was raised Catholic and later became a Protestant to open more doors for his future. In his adulthood, he traveled to British-controlled America, along with 12 other Irish families in 1738, where they established a settlement named Warrensburg on the land owned by his uncle, Peter Warren. In 1739, Johnson purchased a home, farm, and sawmill, which he named Mount Johnson, with the goal of opening trade both with the merchants from New York and the American Indians. Soon after, Johnson began a relationship with Catherine Weisenberg, who would eventually become his common-law wife, and with whom he would have 3 children. In this time, William alienated himself from his uncle as he became more independent and improved his own association with the Mohawk. In 1742, Johnson was adopted by the Mohawk as an honorary civil chief as they hoped to secure a future for their tribe, which had diminished greatly due to war and disease. At this point, he also started a relationship with a Mohawk woman named Elizabeth Brandt, with whom he would later have 3 children. In 1744, King George's War, which was the American theater of the War of Austrian Succession, began. Johnson was made New York's agent to the Iroquois and was given the task of recruiting and arming both colonial and native soldiers against the French. Despite the Iroquois' past stance of neutrality in European conflicts, Johnson and some Mohawk chiefs were able to recruit soldiers for the British. They operated in raiding parties, and Johnson paid his troops for enemy scalps. In 1748, he was promoted to colonel of the New York levies, and soon after, peace was settled. Later that year, Johnson built a stone home known as Fort Johnson, where he would hold diplomatic councils between the British and Iroquois. Following the war's end, he was caught up in a few financial and political complications concerning his new position, culminating in his resignation as New York's commissioner in 1751. His uncle then died in 1752, leaving none of his wealth for William and instead making him pay certain expenses. It would have been around this point where we first met William Johnson in Assassin's Creed 3, when Haytham was establishing his wing of the Templar colonial right. In 1753, the Mohawk chief Hendrik traveled to New York and explained that the Mohawk alliance with the British would end unless Johnson was returned to his post. After Congress was held in Albany, Johnson was returned to his post in 1755. It was at this point where he was noticed by the then assassin Shay Cormac, as Benjamin Franklin spoke outside of the city hall in AC Rogue. Historically, the French and Indian War broke out soon after, and Johnson was made General Edward Braddock's agent to the Iroquois and was promoted to the rank of Major General. His new assignment was to lead an expedition against the French fort at Crown Point. After capturing a French-held lake and renaming it Lake George, the British and native troops under Johnson's command fought the French to defend this new land in the Battle of Lake George. Johnson was wounded by an enemy shot, but survived, while his Mohawk chief ally was killed. The French commander, Baron was captured, but Johnson stopped the Mohawk from killing him. This battle ended the Crown Point expedition, and instead the British built Fort William Henry at Lake George to defend the area. Despite this victory being considered minor, the British had suffered many defeats that year, and therefore Johnson was made a military hero to boost their morale. He was rewarded financially and was given a title of Baronet by King George. In 1756, William Johnson was made the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for all the northern colonies. In this new post, he was no longer under the local government's authority and reported only to London, while also focusing much of the British diplomacy towards his Mohawk allies. In Rogue, this would have been around the point where he would have first met Shay as an ally of the Templars. Despite no longer being part of the army, Johnson still led joint Iroquois and militia forces. In mid-1757, the French attacked Fort William Henry, and Johnson prepared his native and militia troops at Fort Edward to help relieve his allies from the attack. However, due to the decision of General Daniel Webb, he was not allowed to leave. It was following this decision that the forces of George Monroe were massacred after they surrendered to the French, for which William Johnson never forgave Webb. In 1758, after multiple British victories, including Louisbourg and Frontenac, Johnson began amassing more native troops, eventually growing it to a force of 1,000 Iroquois warriors by 1759. They then joined the attack on Fort Niagara, and when the general was killed, Johnson took command and defeated the French, eventually capturing Fort Niagara. He then joined the forces of General Geoffrey Amherst in the final push where Montreal was captured and New France fell to Britain. Afterwards, Johnson spent the following years keeping peace with the native tribes who were former allies of the French. He also began another common law relationship, this time with another Mohawk woman named Molly Brant, and together they had 8 children. After acquiring more land which was given to him by the Mohawk, Johnson became one of the largest landowners in British America, and in 1762 founded the city of Johnstown in New York. He then built his new home, named Johnson Hall, and a school for children of both European and native origins. Many Irish immigrants were invited to live and work for him on his land. In addition, he also established a Freemasons Lodge in Johnson Hall, where he was installed as its master. William also made a point to counter the French Catholic presence by establishing Anglican churches both on his land and in Mohawk villages. Around this period, Assassin's Creed 3 demonstrated his first confrontation with the young Connor while looking for his village. In 1763, the Native Americans revolted against the British policy that followed the French and Indian War, as General Jeffrey Amherst ignored Johnson's suggestions of following Iroquois culture and showing respect to their chiefs. This conflict was known as Pontiac's War, for which Amherst was called back to Britain and was replaced with General Thomas Gage, who allowed Johnson to negotiate a peace treaty with Pontiac that ended the war in 1766. During this period, he also supported a proclamation that put a limit on imperial westward expansion by setting a boundary that would not be passed. However, before it was finalized, to much criticism, Johnson pushed the boundary around 400 miles further than was allowed by the government, thus permitting himself and others to own more land. This, among other things, increased native discontent with the British, and Johnson spent most of the following years trying to prevent another incident like Pontiac's War by using a divide and rule policy, which would have him attempt to block any intertribal native alliances that could potentially turn on the British. One such example would have been how he isolated the Shawnee before Dunmore's War. William Johnson suddenly died on July 11, 1774 from what many attribute to being a stroke during an Indian conference at approximately 59 years of age. Assassin's Creed 3 instead depicted him dying at the hands of Connor during a similar conference at Johnson Hall, however instead with the purpose of purchasing the Iroquois land to protect them from the colonists. In summary, not many of William Johnson's important life events were depicted between Assassin's Creed 3 and Rogue, however there were still a few differences between his actual life and his in-game depiction. Firstly, he was clearly not a member of the Templar Order, however he was a part of the Freemasons, an organization which many believe to hold an ancestral connection to the Templars. Secondly, he did not participate in an attack on the British-held Southgate Fort to help his allies. Thirdly, although he was present at the Albany Congress, he did not have the ulterior motive while there to speak with Benjamin Franklin about a precursor box. Fourthly, he was not involved in the death of General Edward Braddock and instead served under him. Fifthly, Johnson was not running a black market operation with Thomas Hickey to raise funds through the sale of tea. Lastly, the game showed William Johnson being killed by Connor during a conference with the Iroquois at Johnson Hall, but instead he died there of natural causes. Even with these changes, however, I found William Johnson's depiction in the game to be an interesting representation for multiple reasons. One example would be the way it was shown that despite his sometimes violent methods, he truly cared for the Iroquois in AC3 when it was revealed that his reason for purchasing their land was to protect them from the colonists who would eventually come to take it from them. With that final fact, we've finished another episode of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you did, I highly recommend you try out one of the Assassin's Creed games. Thank you all for watching. Please leave any suggestions for future characters, groups, events, or locations from any of the Assassin's Creed games that you'd like me to cover in the comment section below. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you all in a future historical episode.
I could have stopped it. I could have saved you all.